Derrière vous, il suscite des débats passionnés depuis son adoption en 19...
Welcome to the Aporde podcast. In this episode, we consider the very current and relevant debates on public health, pharmaceutical rents, and the role of healthcare as a public good in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our discussion focuses on the manufacture and supply of pharmaceutical treatment products that assist nations to respond to global or even regionalized healthcare crises. From HIV/AIDS to Ebola to COVID-19, we ask why it's important that Africa produces its own vaccines and treatments to supply its treatment needs, and the implications that this has for industrialization. My name is Ayabonga Cawe, and I'm your host. Stay tuned. The COVID-19 pandemic, which over the last 2 years has added new vocabulary to our day-to-day lives, has also shown us how unequally provided a public good healthcare is. If we look beyond the reported infections, daily deaths, and 7-day moving averages, we find that countries, regions, and continents have experienced and continue to experience the virus in varied ways. China has locked down its ports and factories at the turn of every wave of new infections, while some European countries have regretted not taking a harder stance as the spread of the virus destabilized mobility and supply chains the world over. Today, we consider what the contests over pharmaceutical rents tell us about the provision of public health as a public good. I'm joined by Professor Alex van den Heever from the University of Witwatersrand. What about how we've responded to COVID-19 distinguishes it from any other public healthcare crisis?
I mean, there are so many implications from the COVID crisis that kind of bear thinking about. And maybe just as an entry point, I think an unusual feature of this crisis is the fact that the world chose to respond to it in a particular way. Note that not all health crises necessarily result in a sort of a global response. And in many cases, healthcare is actually not evenly distributed, and people don't necessarily respond in a way that kind of allows for a trade-off between the economic consequences of managing the epidemic and the epidemic itself. So I think what has been interesting is that trade-off has occurred, is that people were prepared, countries were prepared to take an economic knock in order to address a public health threat, which is not normal. But it also has suggested that this is the kind of threat which countries are obliged to respond to. But globally, not all countries can respond in equivalent ways. So the economic impacts of sort of lockdowns, etc., can't be sustained by countries such as South Africa or the developing world. They can be sustained for longer periods in more industrialized countries. And so they have, in some cases, been able to be more restrictive because they know that they can kind of mend faster post the epidemic. When you're dealing with a highly infectious airborne pathogen, such as COVID or its equivalents, essentially conventional public health responses don't really work well because it just transmits too fast. So even with a relatively, let's say compared to polio or Ebola, a sort of fairly severe but relatively low mortality rate is still sufficient to create a disaster. And it also creates the requirement that you have to create a solution that covers everybody, otherwise nobody is safe. So you can't build a wall against a pathogen like this, an airborne highly transmissible airborne pathogen, it's going to get you at some point. And no economy can shut down permanently while it waits for the virus to disappear, because it won't, and it hasn't. So vaccines are a critical response, and potentially the only major response other than effective treatments, antivirals of various forms or other kinds of treatments that can address the immune system response. So we actually need to have both therapeutic options, and we have to have preventive options, which are the vaccines.
If vaccines are the most effective way to curb the severe illness and death associated with the virus, procuring them in adequate supply to meet the need, especially in poorer countries, has come with some difficulty. Intellectual property barriers and active pharmaceutical ingredients and access to these are major obstacles preventing developing countries in the global south from effectively participating in making and distributing their own vaccines or any other pharmaceutical product. In so doing, it also makes uneven access to vaccines so central to the public healthcare response to this once-in-a-century crisis.
Now, what's happened is that internationally, these are not the platforms for their development and distribution are not even internationally. And even if you're in a position to potentially purchase them, you can be outbid by countries who are prepared to pay more when they feel they've got a political requirement to respond more expeditiously or in greater depth in their countries. And a further consequence, which we're getting into now, is that if the virus becomes endemic, doesn't go away, and you're going to face repeated waves, and you've got a requirement basically to boost any immunity with further vaccinations, there's the problem that there is an unending unevenness in supply and demand. And so we've got to basically cater for this, because this really can't be sustained internationally. It is unfair in the way that it is occurring, but it requires that the whole supply chain for vaccines and for therapeutic treatments, that not only in this but in many other areas, start to be placed in a position where they can be prioritized more evenly for all countries. But it is not a very easy problem to solve, given the way that people have structured the incentives for the current industry. So there is a need to basically create a more sort of regionalized development and distribution framework, and there's also a need to reconceptualize the whole intellectual property framework around these all medications that are critical to an emergency such as this. So I think that this. So I think that the question really is, can we revision this framework? Now, any pharmaceutical manufacturer that sees that it's got this unending market is not going to give it up easily. If they see that they've got a successful product, it's going to make them money, milk it while you can. That incentive tends in some cases to override any other imperative globally. And for many countries who are benefiting from that, they're not going to want to materially change it. So there is a need to renegotiate these frameworks.
Surely, if the interests or even incentives faced by incumbents or incumbent firms and the current intellectual property regimes create failures in accessing vaccines and other treatments, what can policymakers do to confront these interests and ensure equitable access?
So there are multiple points of entry, because you, on the one hand, you might establish a facility, a public facility, such as BioVac, but the danger there is that they might not be very innovative facilities, and they effectively rely on sort of state support and state governance to function. The other is a sort of a more public-private partnership approach, where you essentially enter into some kind of a set of agreements with manufacturers to set up their own plants. But typically for that, you would have to kind of enter into offtake agreements and things like that. In other words, the state will purchase a minimum supply or book supplies from that in order to cover the demand-related risk that they're taking on in producing. So the state can come in and basically say we will provide a financial subsidy, as the United States and the United Kingdom did. So they don't become the producer themselves. They subsidize. They basically minimize the risk of being associated with being an innovative developer of a new product. So you basically bring down the risk associated with that by essentially entering into pre-purchase agreements of one form or another, or a direct subsidy. In other words, you fully fund a part of the high-risk development process, such as the clinical trials, etc. So that's a further way. I think that if government basically gets involved and creates its own plants, I think that's a relatively inflexible high-risk strategy. The other part is a regulatory one. In other words, you look at interventions that can allow for sort of domestic production to be diverted in certain instances. That would be a further approach. It can be that the intellectual property laws are adjusted so that local manufacturers are able to legitimately adopt somebody else's IP under the coverage of that legal framework, which then needs to be interrogated in relation to the TRIPS frameworks, the whole sort of WTO framework, because it can incur, if seen to be problematic, it can incur sort of countervailing actions by other countries. But I think that the risk that one faces in South Africa is that you might be producing for an emergency like this, but then the demand drops off. So you create a whole plant, and there's viable demand for your product during the pandemic, but 3 years later, there's no demand. And now you're sitting with this overhead cost and no demand for product. So there's a risk associated with putting up physical plants. So what the state can do is find ways also of mitigating that particular risk. Now, one of the ways of doing that is what I said earlier, is that government enters into agreements in which it says we will purchase a minimum amount of whatever you produce from that. We will come into an agreement for a long-term agreement on a sort of an offtake arrangement. But if your domestic market is pretty small, there's only so much you can commit to.
Patrick Soon-Shiong on a mission to put South Africa at the forefront of second-generation vaccine production.
Yeah, he's launched the beginning of a 3 billion rand pharmaceutical facility in Cape Town, and the goal is to produce 1 billion vaccines for the African market by 2025.
Now, the first of these COVID-19 vaccines could roll out of that plant within the next year.
In October 2021, Aspen Pharmacare, South African-based pharmaceuticals manufacturer, launched a new general anesthetic production line. Now, the firm is one of a few vaccine production facilities on the continent. In my visit to the facility in Gqeberha, during the launch, it became clear that significant investment in not only capital, but the transfer of know-how on processes and the distribution of vaccines also required scale economies necessary to bring down unit costs of production and to make production lines commercially viable.
If you look at a country such as South Africa, it's in a position to develop vaccines. It's in a position to innovate in this area. But the manufacture becomes an issue. And one of the problems with that is that if you create a plant to manufacture of any kind, you need to basically have a consistent market for purchasing those medicines. And if your domestic market is relatively narrow, then you can't get the economies of scale necessary to bring down the unit costs of production for it to be viable. So this is the kind of problem that one faces is that you've got to basically be able to invest in production facilities that will potentially be providing products beyond your borders as a necessary requirement in order to be viable, commercially viable. And the question is how to do that when you can't control your access to external markets. So that's one issue to overcome. The other issue is that if you do set up the plant, as we've seen with Johnson & Johnson in South Africa, is that Johnson & Johnson merely procures the services of the site in Quebec from Aspen Pharmacare. And the Johnson & Johnson is basically in complete control of that particular market. Aspen Pharmacare, according to the discussions that I've had with them, have absolutely no control. Essentially, they come there, they buy the production capability, and they export it to whoever they want, and they're not involved. Aspen is not involved in the contract. And neither is South Africa, unless it does something draconian, like essentially sequester the supplies. So, and if you do that, it might succeed in the short term, but it won't succeed in a longer term basis because nobody will come there for production. So there is an issue about making sure that if you create a production plant, that somebody's going to allocate the IP to you so that you can produce and sell, which can be to the local government, local suppliers. So I think this is a further issue to deal with, where the sort of larger manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, have a substantial degree of control over the process of innovation, the costs of the sort of clinical trials, etc., to get through the regulatory processes to get the pharmaceuticals out. That it's quite difficult for an outside player to come in and make those kind of investments and be able to survive and compete. So it's much easier for the larger players to kind of go through these processes because they are quite big. There's a degree of risk associated with them.
So without markets, making the vaccine or any medicines for that matter doesn't really make sense. So demand matters. So if none of the African countries singularly have large enough markets to justify their investment, how do we resolve that? What do we do if we cannot bring unit costs down, if our vaccines are more expensive to produce and sold at a higher price in neighboring countries or regions, or if these regions don't buy any of the vaccines produced here on the continent? How do we solve that?
So you want to be able to sustain this on a long-term basis, but you've got to be able to make sure you've got markets. So I think it just means that it doesn't mean that there are no solutions to this. It means that you've got to develop a solution to that, and you've got to get other countries to agree to that, not only for vaccine production, but for all medicines, that in fact they would be prepared to draw on these facilities domestically as part of creating longer term resilience. Now, certain countries in Africa are going to say, well, if we could get the drugs cheaper from somewhere else, or the vaccines cheaper from Europe, or cheaper from India, we're going to buy them there because why would we pay more just because the plant is regional? So if some countries can capture those markets, you've got to persuade them. You've got to buy from here first before there. So that's one feature. One way of dealing with that is through multilateral agreements. So the kind of agreement that didn't really work terribly well in this pandemic, COVAX, and the AU type agreements, where in fact there's a kind of a pooled purchasing arrangement for all developing countries, and they would actually have a single procurer and then a distribution mechanism based on population out of that. But basically all the countries in the region would be pooling funds, and they would be pooling what they purchase and distributing those. That type of agreement, where the countries have effectively allocated some of the autonomy basically to purchase on their behalf, can provide the certainty for larger scale production. But I would see that as one tier of this kind of demand certainty that you want to create. So you can have multilateral procurement agreements, which can underpin production while you actually evolve and develop straightforward commercial markets for your product globally.
So South Africa and India have been leading an initiative at the World Trade Organization to get an intellectual property waiver to make way for vaccine production in the developing world. What's the story with the use of intellectual property instruments like patents as economic rents. How do we deal with this when some firms say they need the intellectual property protection as an incentive to innovate?
So I think there are two aspects to the IP arrangements. One is to deal with a situation where other people have innovated, and therefore the intellectual property sits with them, and you're essentially trying to gain access to their intellectual property. And the second strategy is where you are investing in local innovation, where you don't have to worry about somebody else's patent. And basically you've created a framework in which you're supporting, in many ways, the innovative aspect of the process. And South Africa has that capability. It can develop new medicines. It can develop vaccines. What it can't do is produce them. So you can solve the IP problem by supporting innovation to the extent that somebody else has created new products and you're trying to capture that. You have to be wary of the retaliation that comes with doing it too sort of crassly. You kind of have to have the agreement of the companies at the moment to kind of get their buy-in, because they say, well, it takes all their incentive to innovate away if essentially you capture all of their innovation, but they went ahead and did this at risk, and now you come as Johnny-come-lately and try and grab their IP. In discussions I've had with various manufacturers at various points, they don't appear to be very concerned about a country like South Africa or even a developing country accessing their IP or even paying less for their products, provided you're not going to take that product, develop it, and sell it back in their high return markets. So they segment the international markets.
So while the know-how may place many African countries in a position to develop their own intellectual property, manufacturing requires more than just know-how. It requires markets and many other complementary private and public investments that will make a pharmaceutical manufacturing undertaking feasible and viable. Alex, you spoke about market segmentation and how some pharmaceutical players would be willing to waive intellectual property rights in instances where developed countries, provided developing country producers don't sell some of these products in their high return markets. Tell us more about that.
This is also a problem in why medicine prices and medical product prices do tend to rise very extremely in many contexts. They segment markets. So the US is a market where they can charge a lot, and so is Europe. And if they can prevent the products from entering from lower cost production areas, and they can't, that might undermine their ability to segment those markets, then they're very unhappy. But if you're prepared to buy their product or even produce it at low cost and sell it domestically and not interfere with their market segmentation strategy, then they're quite happy. The only problem there, as I pointed out earlier, is, well, if you want to produce at scale, your problem is that you need to produce at scale in order to get your unit costs down. If you were looking, for instance, at the conventional vaccines, if you're looking at the mRNA vaccines, the production cost is much lower. Therefore, it's potentially a target for developing country manufacture, and you can solve the problem. You can get lower unit costs without needing the same scale you might need for the Johnson & Johnsons and the AstraZenecas. So there is an issue of the type of medicine you're dealing with and whether or not you need scale to have low unit costs. But if you do need scale for low unit costs and you're confined to your own market segment, then it's not viable. Your country might be having to pay 5 times more for that particular product domestically produced than it could import it. And that product can't be sold anywhere else. So a large manufacturer is probably perfectly happy to give you access, a license, provided you don't sell in their high return markets, but unfortunately, from a production perspective, it might not be viable. So I think that the issue of being able to domestically innovate gives you the freedom to sell your product at scale internationally as well as domestically. I think that the innovative process can in fact be subsidized by government because it's not the highest cost part of the whole process. Manufacturing is the costly part and the one where you've got to kind of generate scale and produce at a level that's viable. But the innovative side, the scientific development of the product can be done locally and supported. And manufacturing can be done commercially. And so it can be up to government as to say, as a condition for the way in which we subsidize innovation, we want this and this to happen with the license. And I think that that's where South Africa has not been terribly creative to date in what it could do in these markets, not only for vaccines, but for a wide range of APIs that would be of value in the developing world.
We also saw the need during the pandemic for the development of cold chains for the storage of vaccines.
So if you see what South Africa has done, despite having a major production plant sort of fill and finish for Johnson & Johnson and within South Africa's borders, we've essentially dispensed Pfizer, which requires the minus 70 degree cold chain protection. And South Africa has managed to overcome that problem on the whole. Now, not every developing country in the region is going to be able to do that. But Pfizer did look at ways in which that problem could be solved so that there's a sort of timelines, there's cooler boxes, there are things like that are done that can make sure that you can distribute the vaccine to a wider range of areas. But it does require that you think it through. So the advantage of the mRNA vaccines, which require these very, very cold temperatures for storage, is that they can be produced cheaply. So I think it's much easier to create a cold chain strategy than it is to kind of invest in a particular production plant. The production plant for the conventional sort of adenovirus type vaccines are much more expensive and create complex problems, but are easier on the cold chain. So I think that it does make sense in the developing country context to solve the cold chain problem. However it does create localization opportunities. I don't think that refrigeration is necessarily something that is technologically outside of the sort of a localization strategy. That you can't develop it and do it locally, and in other words, develop local manufacture for those aspects as well. However, I don't think that's entirely necessary in the strategy. You can do whatever you need to get the cold chain to work, but I do think that the cold chain is an easier problem to solve than low cost of production.
We aren't out of the woods yet, and one wonders whether we have the planning and policy instruments to ride out the next epidemiological crisis, if and when it happens. If the next crisis appears in that wave, of course. Prof, what are your thoughts on how we can collapse the silos between industrial and public health policy, or any other policy areas that interface with industrial concerns? How do we get the policy coordination and execution right?
Yeah, so I think that the reason is because we've got a very complex government structure around thinking around this. And you kind of need to have the parts of government that are looking at industrial policy working together with the parts of government that deal with public health policy, and as well as with the regulation of medicines. And as well as the people who are negotiating multilateral agreements. And you kind of need to bring all of these groups together. I think that government can bring all of that together. I think that the reason why we haven't done it is because it involves sort of some complexity in the policy making process, and in order to make a policy like this, you have to leverage heavily against the external stakeholders. You have to kind of engage with them and kind of co-produce the result. You don't do it as a group of officials doing some research work. You've got to go out there and come up with solutions, try stuff, fail, try more stuff. If regulations need to change, government then needs to work out which regulations need to change and how they do change, and can you enforce what you change. So you need to kind of go on a continuous process of developing that. And I think we haven't invested, for policy, there's a sort of a supply chain as well. And if you don't have that in place, it actually takes quite a while to get a complex policy designed and implemented and continuously improved. So I think we're only at the starting point of looking at some of these areas. So it just doesn't happen overnight, and there isn't this wonderful solution that exists there. It's got to be created, and it has to be created in context. What you create in Brazil is not going to be the same as what we create in the Southern African region. So it's a function of our regulatory frameworks, how our public and private health systems are organized, how the multilateral arrangements are organized in the sort of region, and how these come together, and how the stakeholders themselves. And just note that a lot of the manufacturers, let's say, that are local in South Africa are tied to international manufacturers. They won't enter into arrangements in South Africa that are going to harm some of their markets elsewhere. Their head office will just say no. So we've got to be able to work out which stakeholders you can work with as well in designing these. Who are going to be the people willing to do this domestically and potentially to create products and innovations that compete with other players down the line, because you're going to have to compete and not just produce for governments.
We hope you've enjoyed the rich insights Professor Alex van den Heever has shared with us. We learned how a country can structure its industrial and public health policy responses in a way that allows its industry to compete in global markets, but also ensures, in a public healthcare crisis like COVID-19, that the treatment protocols are accessible to all who require them. The significant role ownership, of course, also has in intellectual property and patents is key in the manufacturing and supply chain of medical products. So too is the role of reducing unit costs of production through scale economies that can be achieved by demand-side planning. It's in this area where policy and regulation can play a significant role alongside other policy areas or change agendas that need to ensure that treatments are accessible and cost-effective. This was the Aporde podcast. From me, your host, Ayabonga Cawe. Till next time, take care.
Derrière vous, il suscite des débats passionnés depuis son adoption en 19...